Have you ever wondered how the ideas of one man could shake the world, inspire revolutions, and influence millions, even long after his death? Before he became one of the most talked-about thinkers in history, Karl Marx was just a boy growing up in a quiet German town, full of curiosity and dreams. Karl was born on May 5, 1818, in the town of Trier, one of the oldest cities in Germany, located near the border of Luxembourg. Trier was small, with cobblestone streets, old Roman ruins, and peaceful neighborhoods surrounded by green hills and forests. At that time, the world was changing fast. New machines were being invented, factories were rising, and many people were moving from farms to cities. Life in cities was hard for poor families, but young Karl didn't yet understand the full meaning of that. He grew up in a large house with his family, in a place where tradition, religion, and old values still had strong roots. Karl's family was originally Jewish, but before he was born, his father, Heinrich Marx, had converted to Christianity. He did this partly because Jews faced discrimination in Germany at the time, and he wanted better opportunities for his children. Heinrich worked as a lawyer and believed in reason, education, and justice. He had a library full of books, and he often spoke to Karl about philosophy and the law. Karl admired his father deeply and loved to listen to his ideas. From a young age, Karl was not like other boys. He didn't just accept things as they were. If someone said, "This is how the world works," Karl would ask, "Why?" He was always asking questions, always wondering if things could be better. When other children were playing games outside, Karl could often be found reading books inside, lost in his own thoughts. By the time he was 12, he had already read many serious books about history, science, and politics. His teachers said he was a brilliant student, though sometimes too confident. He liked to challenge authority, even in the classroom. One of his teachers once wrote that Karl had a powerful will and sharp intelligence, but sometimes a little too much fire. At home, the Marx family lived in comfort, though they were not rich. There were always books around, and conversations were full of ideas and arguments. Karl had many brothers and sisters, and the home was often noisy but full of life. His mother, Henriette, was warm and practical. She didn't care much for politics or philosophy, but she supported Karl's studies. She wanted him to become a lawyer like his father, to live a stable, respected life. But Karl had other plans. In his teenage years, he began to see the problems in the world more clearly. He noticed how some people had so much, while others had so little. He started to feel that this was not fair. He read about revolutions in France, about people fighting for freedom and justice. These stories excited him and made him think, could the world really change? Trier, though peaceful, was still touched by the big changes in Europe. Napoleon had ruled parts of Germany earlier in the century, and his ideas about rights and equality had left a mark. But now, the rulers were going back to old ways. Kings and princes didn't want people asking too many questions. Young Karl, however, couldn't stop asking. He began to write poems, essays, and small pieces about politics and society. His writing was passionate and full of big ideas. Even though he was still very young, he felt a strong desire to understand how the world worked and how it could be improved. When he finished school, Karl decided to go to university. At first, he went to the University of Bonn, where he studied law to please his father. But Karl didn't enjoy law very much. He spent more time in the student clubs, talking about philosophy, art, and literature. He also got into some trouble for drinking and fighting, which worried his parents. So, after a year, his father sent him to the University of Berlin, which was more serious and focused. In Berlin, Karl discovered the works of great philosophers, especially Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel's ideas were difficult but exciting. He talked about history, change, and the idea that human society develops through conflict. Karl was fascinated. He joined a group called the Young Hegelians, who believed in using reason and criticism to challenge the government and religion. For Karl, this was like opening a new door. He began to think deeply about power, freedom, and what it means to live a good life. His letters from that time show a young man full of energy, writing late into the night, filling pages with thoughts, questions, and dreams. But not everyone was happy with his ideas. The government didn't like students talking about change. They were afraid of revolution and tried to control what people read and wrote. This only made Karl more determined. He believed that thinking freely was not a crime. As he grew older, Karl's world became bigger. He started to see how all the pieces fit together: money, work, power, and people's lives. He was no longer just a curious boy from Trier. He was becoming a thinker, a man with a mission. The journey of Karl Marx was just beginning. The questions he asked as a child would grow into ideas that would challenge kings, governments, and the way society was built. And it all started in a small town, with a boy who couldn't stop asking why. A boy who believed the world could and should be different. By the time Karl Marx was in his early 20s, he was fully absorbed in the world of philosophy, writing, and radical thinking. The university environment in Berlin had opened his mind to new questions, new ideas, and new people who, like him, believed the world needed change. He became friends with a group of intellectuals who didn't just want to study the world. They wanted to transform it. These students and young writers gathered in coffee houses and small apartments, debating politics, religion, and economics late into the night. Karl felt alive in these conversations. He was no longer just observing society. He was starting to shape ideas that could challenge it. But even with all the passion and discussion, Karl was still trying to find his own voice. He read books from morning to night, taking notes, writing responses, and exploring different viewpoints. While many of his peers talked about ideas in abstract ways, Karl wanted something more. He wanted a philosophy that could explain the real lives of workers, families, and entire nations. He saw poverty and inequality not just as sad facts of life, but as deep problems caused by how society was built. He believed these problems could be studied, understood, and eventually solved. As he moved deeper into his studies, Karl began to lose interest in becoming a professor or staying in the academic world. He didn't want to spend his life giving lectures or writing essays that only a few people would read. Instead, he dreamed of reaching the wider public. He believed that real change would only come if ordinary people could understand what was wrong with society and how to fix it. It was during this time that Karl fell in love. Her name was Jenny von Westphalen, a beautiful and intelligent woman from a noble family. Jenny had known Karl since childhood. They grew up in the same town and had spent hours talking and laughing together in their youth. Despite their different backgrounds, his more modest, hers more aristocratic, the two shared a deep connection. Jenny was supportive of Karl's ideas, even though they were considered dangerous and radical. She believed in his passion and stood by him, even when her own family disapproved of their relationship. Their love letters were filled with affection and respect, as well as discussions about politics, poetry, and the future. They promised to marry, even though they knew life might be difficult. While Karl continued to write and think, he also started working as a journalist. His first major job was with a newspaper in Cologne, where he wrote about political issues, social injustice, and the lives of ordinary people. He was not afraid to criticize the government or powerful business owners. He wrote with clarity and passion, and readers began to notice his bold voice. The paper gained popularity, but it also drew attention from the authorities. The government didn't like what Karl was saying. Before long, the newspaper was shut down, and Karl was forced to leave Germany. It would not be the last time that his ideas got him into trouble. Even as he faced censorship and exile, Karl refused to be silent. He believed that the truth was more important than comfort. He moved to Paris with Jenny, hoping to find a new start in a city full of political and artistic life. There, Karl met other thinkers and activists from around Europe. Paris was alive with energy, full of people who were asking the same kinds of questions he was. How should society be organized? Why were so many people poor while a few lived in luxury? One of the most important moments in Karl's life happened in Paris in 1844. That year, he met Friedrich Engels, a man who would become his closest friend and most important collaborator. Engels was the son of a wealthy factory owner in Germany, but he had spent time in England and had seen with his own eyes the terrible conditions in the factories. Despite his background, Engels cared deeply about workers and wanted to fight for justice. He had already written a book about the poor working conditions in industrial England. When Marx and Engels met, they quickly realized they shared the same ideas and goals. Their friendship was instant, and their partnership would last for the rest of Karl's life. Engels supported Karl not only intellectually, but also financially. He helped pay for Karl's expenses, gave feedback on his writing, and stood beside him during hard times. Together, they began to write and plan for something bigger. They wanted to create a new way of understanding history, politics, and society, one that explained the struggles of ordinary people and offered a vision for a better future. These early years of adulthood were full of struggle, hope, and hard work for Karl Marx. He was still finding his path, but the pieces of his future philosophy were coming together. He had found love, friendship, and a sense of purpose. And with Engels by his side, Karl was ready to take the next step toward changing the world. In early 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were ready to share their boldest work yet. They had spent years discussing history, power, and economics, and now they were about to put their ideas into one document that would call for a new kind of world. This document was called the Communist Manifesto. It was short, direct, and powerful, designed to be read by workers and revolutionaries, not just scholars. It began with a sentence that would become famous. "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." The line was meant to show that something new was coming, something that frightened the ruling class but gave hope to the poor. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels explained their view of history as a struggle between classes. They wrote that for centuries, the world had been divided into rich and poor, rulers and workers, those who owned property and those who created value through labor. They argued that the time had come for workers, or the proletariat, to unite and overthrow the old systems that kept them poor and powerless. They didn't just want small changes. They wanted a complete transformation of society. They called for the end of private ownership of factories, land, and capital. They wanted these things to belong to everyone, shared fairly among all. To many people at the time, this was a shocking idea. To others, it was a message of hope and justice. The manifesto spread quickly, especially in places where workers were unhappy with their lives. It was translated into many languages and carried across borders by revolutionaries and activists. It was published just before a wave of revolutions swept through Europe in 1848. In many countries, people rose up against kings, empires, and unfair governments, demanding more rights and better living conditions. Marx and Engels were excited by this movement. They believed that history was on their side and that the revolution of the working class had begun. But the reality was more difficult. The revolutions were not well organized, and many of them failed within months. Governments used their armies to crush protests, and old powers returned to control. Marx was forced to leave yet another country, this time Belgium, where he had been living. He returned to Germany briefly, where he tried to take part in the revolutionary movement, editing a newspaper and writing articles to inspire people. But again, the government shut him down. After this, Karl Marx moved to London with his wife Jenny and their children. It would become his home for the rest of his life, though it was never an easy one. In London, Karl lived in poverty. He struggled to support his family, often relying on money from Engels to survive. They lived in small, crowded apartments, and the Marx family suffered many tragedies, including the death of several of their children due to poor living conditions. Still, Karl did not give up. He spent his days in the British Museum, reading and researching. He wanted to write a complete and scientific explanation of how capitalism worked. He believed that capitalism was not just an unfair system, but one that followed specific rules and patterns that could be studied like a science. His goal was to uncover these patterns and show how they always led to inequality, crisis, and eventually collapse. The result of this work would be a massive book called Does Kapital. It would take him years to write, and even longer to finish, but it would become one of the most important books in economic history. While he worked on it, Karl also wrote letters to revolutionaries in Europe and America, trying to keep the movement alive. He helped organize a new political group called the International Workingmen's Association, also known as the First International. This group brought together workers from different countries who wanted to fight for better conditions and social justice. Though Karl was often sick and tired, he kept working. He believed that the future depended on people understanding the truth about their economic system. He hoped that one day, workers everywhere would read his words, rise up, and build a world without exploitation or poverty. Karl Marx may have been poor and unknown for most of his life, but during these years in London, he laid the foundation for ideas that would go on to influence generations. The Communist Manifesto had introduced his vision. Das Kapital would become the detailed map. With the support of Engels and his own unstoppable drive, Marx continued his work in the shadows of history, planting ideas that would one day grow far beyond what he could have imagined. When Karl Marx published the first volume of Das Kapital in 1867, it was the result of decades of study, thought, and personal struggle. The book was not written for quick reading or easy approval. It was dense, filled with complex theories and deep analysis. Marx wanted to explain how capitalism really worked, far beyond what most people saw in their daily lives. He believed that behind every price, every wage, and every transaction there were hidden systems of power and control. Das Kapital argued that workers produced all value through their labor, but the profits of that labor were taken by the owners of capital. In other words, the people who did the work received the least, while those who owned the factories and resources grew rich. Marx called this exploitation, and he believed it was the foundation of capitalism. The system was not based on fairness or hard work, but on the ability of the few to profit from the many. He explained how competition between businesses forced them to cut costs, which often meant lowering wages and making work harder for laborers. Over time, this would create cycles of boom and bust, periods of growth followed by crisis. He believed these cycles were not accidents, but built into the system itself. According to Marx, capitalism would always lead to greater inequality and deeper social divisions. He also introduced the concept of surplus value, a key idea in his theory. This was the value created by workers that went beyond what they were paid, and it was the source of profit for business owners. To Marx, this showed that the system relied on taking more from workers than it gave back. It was not just unfair, it was unsustainable. Despite the importance of these ideas, Das Kapital was not an instant success. It was difficult to read, and most people at the time were not familiar with its kind of economic theory. But among thinkers, activists, and some workers' organizations, the book became a serious topic of discussion. Some praised Marx for his clear and powerful arguments. Others criticized him, saying he was too negative or unrealistic. Marx did not mind the criticism. He believed that truth took time to be understood, and he was more concerned with being accurate than being popular. He continued to work on the next volumes of Das Kapital, but he was often slowed down by illness, poverty, and personal tragedy. His wife Jenny, who had supported him through every challenge, became ill and passed away in 1881. Her death broke Karl's heart. Their life together had been full of struggle, but also deep love and loyalty. They had shared dreams, hardships, and a commitment to building a better world. Losing Jenny was a heavy blow, and Marx's own health was also failing. He had spent years working long hours, often without rest, and the stress had taken its toll. Still, he kept writing, reading, and corresponding with other political leaders. He gave advice to socialist parties forming in Europe and followed news of strikes and workers' movements with interest. He saw that his ideas were beginning to spread, slowly taking root in the minds of people who felt forgotten by the world around them. Even in his later years, Marx did not see himself as a hero or a prophet. He often said that he was not inventing ideas out of nowhere. He was studying real life and pointing out patterns that others ignored. His goal was not to create a new system of rules, but to help people understand the forces shaping their lives so they could change them. In 1883, Karl Marx died quietly in London at the age of 64. At the time, only a small group of people attended his funeral. Among them was Friedrich Engels, his closest friend and comrade. Engels gave a simple but moving speech, saying that Marx had been the greatest thinker of their time. Though Marx had lived most of his life in obscurity and poverty, his ideas would not die with him. In fact, his death marked the beginning of a new chapter. Over the next decades, socialist and communist movements grew stronger across the world. People began reading Marx not just as a critic of capitalism, but as a guide for revolution. His theories inspired debates, protests, and in time, political parties and governments. Though not everyone agreed on how to apply his ideas, few could deny their influence. From a young boy in Trier who asked too many questions, to a philosopher who challenged the entire structure of society, Karl Marx had left a mark on history that could not be erased. And it all started with a simple belief that the world, no matter how broken, could be understood and changed. After Karl Marx's death in 1883, many people believed his work might fade into history. He had died in poverty, with only a few books published and a small group of supporters by his side. But in the years that followed, his ideas began to grow and spread far beyond what even he might have imagined. One of the main reasons Marx's legacy survived was the tireless effort of his friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels. After Marx's death, Engels took on the task of editing and publishing the remaining volumes of Das Kapital, using Marx's notes and drafts. Engels believed deeply in the importance of Marx's work. He wanted to make sure that the world understood the full picture of their shared vision, even if it meant years of difficult work. By the 1890s, Marx's writings were being studied by political thinkers, labor leaders, and activists around the world. As industrialization spread and workers faced longer hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions, many turned to Marxism to understand the causes of their suffering. Socialist and labor parties began to appear in different countries. They used Marx's ideas to argue for fairer wages, better working conditions, and more rights for ordinary people. In Germany, the Social Democratic Party became one of the largest political forces in the country, campaigning on ideas that were heavily influenced by Marx. In France, Russia, Britain, and beyond, Marxist thought inspired both peaceful reform and calls for revolution. Workers organized strikes and protests, demanding to be treated with dignity. Some groups focused on gradual change through laws and elections, while others believed that only a full revolution could bring justice. By the early 20th century, Marx's name had become known far beyond Europe. His books were translated into dozens of languages, and political groups from Asia to South America were using his theories to understand the challenges their countries faced. The real turning point came in 1917, more than 30 years after Marx's death. In Russia, a group of revolutionaries led by Vladimir Lenin took control of the country and overthrew the old government. Lenin and his followers were strongly influenced by Marx's ideas. They believed they were carrying out the kind of worker-led revolution that Marx had described. They established a new government based on communist principles, and for the first time, Marx's theories were being used to shape an entire nation. This event, the Russian Revolution, sent shockwaves across the globe. For supporters, it was proof that Marx's ideas could change the world. For opponents, it was a sign of danger. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union was created, and other countries began to explore or adopt Marxist systems. Some looked to Marx as a symbol of hope, while others saw him as a threat to their way of life. Debates over his legacy became part of political life in many parts of the world. In schools, universities, newspapers, and parliaments, people argued about whether Marx was a genius, a dreamer, or a danger. What was clear, however, was that his influence was undeniable. Movements for workers' rights, anti-colonial struggles, and debates about capitalism all drew on his ideas. Even those who disagreed with Marx often had to respond to his theories, because they had become such a central part of modern political thought. By the mid-20th century, Marx's image was known everywhere. Statues of him stood in city squares, his books were printed in millions of copies, and his name was invoked in speeches, protests, and manifestos. But as his ideas spread, they also changed. Different leaders and movements interpreted Marx in different ways, sometimes twisting his words to fit their goals. Not everything done in the name of Marxism stayed true to what Karl Marx himself believed. Some regimes that called themselves Marxist became authoritarian, using power to control rather than to liberate. This led to criticism from many sides. Some people said Marx's ideas were dangerous. Others argued that his theories were misused, and that the problem was not Marx's vision, but how it was applied. Still, through all the debates, the core of Marx's work remained a powerful tool for understanding the world. His analysis of class, power, and economics continued to inspire both scholars and activists. Karl Marx, once a poor philosopher writing in a London flat, had become a global figure. His ideas helped shape the 20th century and sparked discussions that continue into the 21st. Even today, in a world very different from the one Marx lived in, people read his work to make sense of inequality, capitalism, and the possibility of a better future. Though he never saw the revolutions or recognition his work would bring, Karl Marx's legacy lives on in every question we ask about fairness, power, and how society should be built. More than a century after Karl Marx's death, his ideas continue to echo through history, education, and politics. In cities across the globe, students still study his writings, activists still quote his theories, and debates about his beliefs continue to shape the way people think about the world. Even in places where governments rejected Marxism, his influence never fully disappeared. His questions about inequality, power, and justice are still relevant today. In modern universities, Marx is often taught not just as a political thinker, but as a philosopher, sociologist, and economist. Professors and students discuss his ideas alongside those of other major thinkers, comparing and testing their value in the light of new realities. Many of Marx's predictions didn't come true exactly as he imagined. He believed that capitalism would collapse under its own weight and that workers across the world would rise up in revolution. While revolutions did happen in some countries, global capitalism proved more adaptable than Marx had expected. But that does not mean his work was in vain. In fact, some of his ideas, like the concentration of wealth, the struggle between rich and poor, and the instability of economic systems, have proven to be incredibly accurate. Today, as the gap between the richest and the poorest continues to grow in many countries, people often return to Marx's work to find explanations. His concept of class struggle still helps to make sense of political and economic tensions. The rise of technology and automation has also sparked new interest in his ideas. As machines replace human labor in more and more industries, questions about the value of work and the future of employment have become central. Some thinkers argue that Marx's vision needs to be updated for a digital world, but the core of his message remains powerful. That society should be organized in a way that serves the needs of all, not just the few. In some places, Marx is still celebrated with statues, museums, and public lectures. In others, his legacy remains controversial, with people divided over whether his influence was helpful or harmful. The truth is complex. While many governments that claimed to follow Marxism failed to live up to his ideals, his writings were never meant to be used as a strict rule book. They were a call to think critically, to question power, and to imagine new possibilities. Even those who strongly disagree with Marx often acknowledge the depth and seriousness of his work. He was not just a protester or a dreamer. He was a man who tried to understand the world at its deepest level, and who believed that people could change it for the better. His life was far from easy. He faced poverty, illness, political exile, and personal loss. But through it all, he kept writing, kept questioning, and kept hoping. He never lived to see the full impact of his work. But the ideas he left behind grew beyond any one country, one party, or one time. Karl Marx's story is more than a tale of one man. It's a story about courage, curiosity, and the power of ideas. It shows how one person, armed with words and determination, can challenge the strongest systems and leave a lasting mark on the world. Whether people see him as a hero, a villain, or something in between, few would deny that Marx changed the way we think about society, history, and justice. And in every corner of the globe, from classrooms to city streets, the questions he asked still echo. Who holds the power? Who creates the value? And how can we build a world that is fair for everyone? Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Karl Marx. From a curious boy in Trier to one of the most influential thinkers in history, Marx's story is a reminder of how powerful ideas can be, even when the world isn't ready to hear them. Whether you agree with his theories or not, his work has sparked conversations that continue to shape politics, economics, and philosophy today. If this story made you think, helped you understand history a little better, or simply introduced you to new ideas, consider sharing it with others. And if you're learning English, we hope that listening to real stories like this one helps you grow your vocabulary, improve your listening, and connect with meaningful content. There are many more stories ahead, so don't forget to subscribe to Lang Fac and turn on notifications, so you never miss a new episode. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and remember, every great thinker was once just a student curious about the world.